There's a new COVID booster, as you've probably heard. Now, the CDC is recommending that everybody 6 months old and over get one. Yet the state of Florida is recommending that nobody get one under the age of 65. Now, there are other people who have a more nuanced opinion about this, including me. So let's talk about it. Hey everybody, it's Dr. David. So as I've continued to talk about, I want to present the information as much as I have available to me. And of course, while I realize that there is public healthcare policy when organizations like the CDC make recommendations that they're trying to cover the whole population, that there's also private healthcare policy where on an individual level, people have to weigh the pros and cons, the benefits and risks of all of the options that are out there. And of course, I firmly advocate for autonomy, for people to be able to make their own decisions about their health, for people to be involved in making choices as to what they think is the best thing for their health and for that of their family. Okay, now this new vaccine booster that has just come out, it targets an Omicron variant called XBB.1.5, okay? Now, this particular variant, it's not even around anymore. As you probably, if you keep up with these things, these new variants are coming out all the time. They've been in the Omicron mode for the most part of the last almost 2 years, which is obviously good because that means there haven't been major mutations. Even in terms of some of the most recent variants you've heard of that are significantly different, the research is now showing that they're not that much different and that past antibodies still protect against them. Now, the drug manufacturers, the vaccine companies, are saying that the new versions of the vaccines will work just as well. At least that's what they show in the lab. But there's been no human testing on these against the most current ones because, of course, they're changing. A month ago, things were different than what there are now. So, they can do the best that they can, but obviously things are changing. But also understanding that as long as things are staying in the Omicron mode and an Omicron vaccine is given, it should be a decent match. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that how successful it is. That's a different story. But the CDC is also hoping to make this an annual flu, like an annual shot for COVID, similar to like the flu. Now, what have we seen in terms of the flu vaccine before? Every year they try to predict what will happen next year. They will use what happened in the southern hemisphere, etc., which happened 6 months sooner. And sometimes they guess reasonably well, sometimes they guess not so good at all, and it's luck of the draw, based upon also some, of course, scientific experience, but there hasn't been amazingly good coverage for the flu for a long time, if ever. Okay, now in terms of one of the things that is kind of well understood now is that past immunity, whether it's from a vaccine or from having the wild disease, or even does not really prevent against getting sick after a relatively short period of time. Severity of illness, that is different, but in terms of not getting sick whatsoever, the information that we were being told a couple of years ago has turned out to not be true. Now, obviously, people were making decisions at that time, and in hindsight, being 2020, of course, we're going to learn about that. Not everything that was being told to us was true, and of course, we have to make our own decisions as to how to predict what will happen in the future. And I'm sure, as we've said time and time again, I'm sure a year or two from now, what we're saying now is probably not going to be 100% accurate, but we all do the best we can, right? Now, but a lot of the research is showing now that within 4 weeks of a person getting a COVID vaccine, that the antibodies and the protection is already starting to fade. And that really, and it continues to fade more and more as the weeks and months go on. And most people feel 6 to 8 months that a vaccine is not really providing that much protection. Again, it may be providing protection against hospitalization, but certainly is not providing protection against catching the disease. Now, what you're seeing here now is a graphic that is being put out by the CDC. And one of the ways that we're now tracking COVID disease is not by positive tests. We know that there are people who are asymptomatic, people who have minimal cold types of symptoms. In fact, no one's even checking and tracking the actual numbers of positive tests anymore. But what is now being checked more frequently is wastewater. So obviously, if overall in our sewage, etc., if we are seeing the number of the amount of the viral particles showing up, that's obviously one way of indicating that the virus is picking up again. And then the other one, which as you can see here, is by hospitalizations. And I want to point out that nowadays, unlike at the beginning where everybody was being tested if they went into a hospital, and so there were people who were being admitted with COVID, not because of COVID. And so, of course, those numbers weren't overly reliable because they were just hospitalizations. But now, considering that in hospital settings, the only time that they're testing is when somebody has a COVID symptom. That's different. Okay, so now they're differentiating people between people who have COVID and are being admitted because of COVID as opposed to just with COVID. So these types of numbers are more reliable. And as you see here, for most age groups, there's been like even the smallest of blips in terms of the hospitalizations. But look at what it shows after 70 years of age. You see those numbers are climbing. Now, not anywhere close to the numbers that you see from about 9 months prior this past winter. We're not anywhere near those types of numbers. But you can clearly see that there is this jump in hospitalizations in the 70-year-old and above. And so I think that that is something to be taking into consideration when looking at all of this. Okay? Now, let's talk more about who's recommending what. Now, as I mentioned, the CDC is recommending that all people over 5 years old should get one of the new shots. It doesn't matter if they've had anyone before, but they're recommending it now. Now, of course, you'd have to question how many people are going to be taking a vaccine for the first time now 3 years into this whole thing, but that's what the recommendation is. And of course, and they're also saying that people between 6 months and 5 years old, for the youngest of children, they're actually saying 1 or 2 depending on their vaccine status. So they're saying that the young kids should be should be having more doses than the adults. Now, from everything that we've seen from COVID, do we really think that the kids are the ones that are high risk? Now, there are exceptions, of course, and high-risk people, etc., okay? But from the very, very beginning, we knew that this was not a very impactful disease on kids. Of course, they could pass it to older people. But for kids, they were kind of the ones who got off pretty easy on this one for the most part. So it's a little unclear to me as to why they're recommending 1 or 2, and especially since almost everybody's had COVID at this point at least once. And of course, we've talked about hybrid immunity or natural immunity being an important part and potentially even more important for past in terms of what your long-term immunity will be. Okay. Now, the state of Florida is recommending the exact opposite. And this is from a statement that was put out by the Florida Surgeon General. The exact opposite. So he's actually recommending against anybody under the age of 65 getting a COVID vaccine. Now, I've shared before, I kind of have a little issue with saying that you recommend against something as opposed to saying I don't recommend. Because to me, when you're saying I don't recommend, that's a much more solid recommendation. And I think that, there was no mention even in this statement. It's a formal statement from the Surgeon General. There was no nuance there. There was no mention about high-risk populations under the age of 65. Just flat out, nobody that they recommend not getting it under the age of 65. Okay? And again, to me, that seems a bit extreme considering that there are extenuating circumstances for some people. Okay? Now, and so again, if it's going to be like an annual shot, it's going to be an annual shot. Let's not even get into that anymore because that's not what we're talking about. But one of the things that they also said that that this was granted in absence of any meaningful booster-specific clinical trial data performed in humans. Well, again, as I said before, of course there was not for this particular booster. But we do have data based upon previous boosters. Okay, so to say that, I think that this is misleading to say that because because this is a modified version of vaccines that have had meaningful research done. Now, you can argue the merits of that research, okay, but at the same time, there were very, very large studies done on this. So I think that is misleading. Okay, and so again, that's kind of where they're coming from. Now, I will say this in the Surgeon General's statement about this. He did put a few really good things in there. Stuff that we've been talking about forever, such as staying physically active. So these are part of his recommendations. Recommending don't get the shot, but he's recommending stay physically active. Minimize processed foods. Maximize vegetables and healthy fats. Spend time outside and support your vitamin D levels. Well, hallelujah for those things. I mean, obviously, hanging out with me and listening to this stuff, you've known all of that. But it is nice to see a formal document saying that the CDC hasn't come out that strong. So, I do want to give credit where credit's due, and I do think that those are wonderful recommendations. Okay. Now, I want to bring in somebody else here, which is Dr. Paul Offit. Okay. And I've talked about him from time to time. He is a pediatrician. He's an infectious disease expert at University of Pennsylvania. He is also one of the advisors for the FDA, for the advisory committee for vaccines. He is one of the people that I presented to at the beginning with all of the vaccines when I did my 3 different presentations about my views of the vaccine from originally from Pfizer and then from Moderna and then for children that I was asked to come speak for. And he was one of the people who listened to that. Now, in my opinion, and following him throughout this entire process, I think he is the most level-headed national expert advisory person on this, okay? And he has questioned the need for COVID shots for kids in the past. He's been on statement on that, okay? And he also says that he believes that the shots should be recommended in this most recent statement that he made about this vaccine, or relative to the coming out of this vaccine. He actually said that he believes that the shots should be recommended annually only for high-risk groups, right? And we know kids aren't high risk overall. He also says that studies have not shown that the booster shots protect against disease in low-risk populations, which, as I said, it doesn't stop you from getting sick, but, what can it do for other at-risk people? So, yay, Paul Offit. I really says, to me, that's really kind of more where I'm at. I think that there are populations whose benefits will outweigh the risks, but I'm really glad that someone like Paul Offit continues to be the person. He's actually voted against some of these boosters in terms of the way that they're given. So, he's somebody to follow. If you want to kind of keep an eye on what's going on, when he speaks, I do listen a little bit more. I think that there's something there. Okay. So what is my take on all of this? I know this is something that you guys are waiting on. So first of all, it won't protect. So this shot will not protect against infection, at least not more than a few weeks out. Okay. Now, those who have antibodies, of course, are protected. Some level of protection. Now, the antibody levels do fade. We've talked in the past about how T cells are those memory cells are there, and they'll start making the antibodies first. But if the antibodies are present in your body, it attacks the virus immediately. Doesn't need to revving up as much of those T cells to make more antibodies, or to recognize that we make more antibodies, actually, I should say. So that's obviously that, but but the antibodies will protect against severity. I think that that's pretty well established at this point. Okay, and of course, if you've been more recently infected, then of course that protects even more. Not just because you have the antibodies, but if you've been recently infected, it's closest to the variants that are out now. In hindsight, okay. Now, do high-risk people and people especially of low immunity, regardless of age, I do think that they will benefit more from this vaccine, and not just in the above 65, but really at any age. I do think that they're on an individual basis that there are people, and those are the people that I think will have the best chance of getting a benefit if they choose to get the vaccine. Now, of course, always talk about my immune support protocol, my COVID response protocol that we've shared many times on this channel here before, and of course making the good vitamin D and the zinc levels going into that, because I'm glad to hear what there wasn't any mention of zinc in the Florida report, but hey, vitamin D, right? We're moving in the right direction. But also know what the accessibility is and the availability of pharmaceutical options that are out there. Okay, I know a lot of doctors even are not giving Paxlovid to people. I personally found it work very well. I found it work on most people very well. Usually within 1 or 2 days, I've seen very significant improvements. If you can handle the aftertaste, that's like the metallic aftertaste. Some people get a little nauseousness or whatever like that. So I do find that cinnamon and some other strong flavors can mask that metallic taste. But especially if you're a high-risk person and things are starting to escalate, I do think it's a really viable option. Okay, so there's my take it all. There's where we are now. Who knows what information will come out in the next couple weeks, but at least as of the middle to end part of September, now you know a little more. Have a nice day.